Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We will present about the database of University Library. I'm Khaled Makawirilang from Group 2, and I'm a group with Shafiq and Priya.
Next, ARD. In ARD, there is member of library. In member of library, there is address, ID member, major, name, validity period, name, and gender. Next to borrow. In borrow, there is borrow date, ID member, ID borrow, book code, return date, and officer. Next, book. In book, there is book code, title, author, publisher, publication year. Next, return. In return, there is number of borrow days late, number of borrow days late actual, ID borrow, officer, total fine, and ID return.
And then on our project we have schema and table. For schema we have 4 and the table we have 2. And then for schema that contains of borrow book, table member of library, table book and return book. And for the table we have 4 table. There are table borrow book, and for table borrow book that contains of ID borrow, ID member, book code, borrow date, return date, and then officer. And then table member of library. In this table that contains of name, major, gender, address, ID member, and validity period. And then we have table return book. In this table that contains of ID return, ID borrow, number of borrow days, number of borrow days actual, total fine, and then officer. And the last is table book. In table book that contains of book code, title, author, publisher, and then publication year.
As we can see on the schematic diagram, there's borrow book, which include ID borrow, ID member, book code, borrow date, return date, and officer. Then we have schematic diagram of table member of library, which is include an IM, name, major, gender, address, ID member, and validity period. Then we have the schematic diagram of return book, which is include ID return, ID borrow, number of borrow days actual, total fine, and officer. And the last schematic diagram, there's table book, which is include book code, title, author, publisher, and publication year.
Table design. In table design, there is table member of library. Name, date type int, weight strip, description, code of student. Name, varchar, weight 50, description, name of student. Major, varchar, 50, major of student. Gender, data type is varchar, weight 50, description, gender of student. Address, data type varchar, weight 50, description, address of student. ID member, data type int, weight strip, description, code of member. Validity period, data type date, weight strip, description, validity of member. And there is table borrow book. In table borrow book, there is ID borrow, data type varchar, weight 50, description, ID of borrow book. ID member, data type int, weight strip, description, code of member. Book code, data type varchar, weight 50, description, code of book that will be borrowed. Borrow date, data type date, weight strip, description, date of borrow book. Return date, data type varchar, weight 50, description, date of return book. Officer, data type varchar, weight 50, description, officer when borrowing book.
And next is table book and table written book. Table book that contains of book code. Book code, the type data that used is varchar, and the weight is 50, and the description of book code is code of book that will borrowed, and then the, the contents is title. Uh, the data type that used is varchar, and the weight is 50, and the description of title is title of book, and then author. The data type that used in author is varchar, and the weight of the type is 50, and the description of author is author of book, and then the content is publisher. Publisher. Uh, Data type that used in publisher is varchar, and the weight is 50, and the description of publisher is publisher of book in the library. And then the last in table book is publication year. The data type that used in publication year is date, and the description of publication year is publication year of book in the library. And the last is table return book. Table return books that contains of ID return. ID return, the data type for ID return is varchar, and the weight is 50, and the description of ID return, that is ID of return book for every student. And then the content is ID borrow, and the data type that used for ID borrow is varchar, and the weight for that type is 50, and the description of ID borrow is ID of borrow book for every student that borrow book. And then the next is number of borrow days. The data types that used in number of borrow days is integer, and then the description of number of borrow days is book borrowing book period actual, and then number of borrow days actual. The data type for number of borrow day actual is integer, and the description of number of borrow days actual is book borrowing book.
On the validation performed, there is table member of library, which the validation required is an IM major gender address ID member validity period. The method we use on the validation is check constraint like statement not null causing the create table statement. On the table return book, the validation require ID return, ID borrow, number of days, number of borrow days actual, total fine officer, and the method that we use on the validation is check constraint like statement, not null, clause in the create table statement. On the table borrow book, the validation require ID borrow must be in this format, B0909, ID borrow, ID member, book code, borrow date, return date, and officer. The method that we use in the table borrow book validation is check constraint like statement, then check constraint like statement not null, clause in the create table statement. And the last validation performed on the table book, the validation require book code, title, author, publisher, and publication year. And the method that we use on the validation table book is check constraint like statement not null, clause in the create table statement.
Configuration. Hardware. Laptop Asus TUF F15, laptop Lenovo IdeaPad Slim 3, and laptop Dell Latitude E5270. Software Microsoft SQL Server 2012 Management Studio and Microsoft Office Word 2019. Project file details. File name restaurantdatabase.word and remarks. Word document contain relation.